I believe I'm technically the coordinator of this session, so maybe by way of introduction, I'll just tell Sarah a little bit how the last meeting with Maggie went, and then maybe we can follow that kind of that structure a little bit, because I thought it worked pretty well. So last time, Sarah, Maggie spent the first, 10 minutes or so introducing her work, describing kind of some background, how she came, what's that expression in phenomenology, how you are like called to it or something? Turn. Yes. How that happened, and then just kind of the process, the data collection and the analysis. And then after that introduction, and maybe during that introduction, people can note some questions that they have, and then we can ask you questions either verbally or in the chat box.
For me, something that helps me to write is to run. And that's kind of where I started with this, with the phenomenon of movement meditation for finding a flow in thinking and writing, was that from my own personal practice as a running writer. And then working with high school students who told me over and over that they could not write. So especially boys, boys who played football, boys who were very physically active, who were in these wee little desks, who couldn't move mentally and who couldn't move physically, and who really strongly felt that they were not capable of writing. So that's kind of where I started. And from there, so the chapters that you're not seeing. So that first chapter is kind of my association with the phenomenon and coming at it from the angle of a writer and a runner, but also from the angle as a teacher. And thinking about how it had been a transformative experience for me to find physical activity that allowed me to think more clearly and to move. And then the second chapter kind of uses as sources the kind of ongoing works of other runners who write, writers who walk. I pulled in some brain research and some other texts, maybe related to things like yoga and thinking, some interesting kind of new agey stuff, and also work with some writers in transactional theory and things like that. The third chapter is the philosophical groundings, and my primary guiding philosopher was Merleau-Ponty, who really works with embodiment and the sense that all we know through our bodies. So that it's not possible to parse out our awareness from an embodied awareness. So that's kind of where I started. So those are the first three chapters, and then the fourth chapter is kind of the findings chapter, where I document the meetings that I had with my participants, who were 4 high school English teachers. We went for walks in the woods. We went for walks on the C&O Canal. I gave them journals, and I asked them to write. So all of the conversations that are coming out of that are their writing and their thinking, conversations with me. Some small conversations with just 2 of them, or 1 of them, and then larger conversations with the whole group after sessions of walking and writing. The 5th chapter is pedagogical implications, and you also don't have that chapter. So it takes all of their thinking and their words and relates it to teaching practice. So that last chapter is more about what happens in their classrooms. The chapter that you have is more about them and their lived experience as writers on this journey, and also to some extent as teachers. But the 5th chapter is really much more about classroom practice than the 4th chapter. I'm not sure what else you want to know right now, but that's kind of a summary of the whole.
Did you design that structure, Sarah? Or is that like a standard phenomenological dissertation structure?
That's standard. Chapter 1 is always the personal turn. Chapter 2 is the phenomenon gathered from outside. So in literature, in art, in poetry, in research, other research. The 3rd chapter is always philosophical groundings. The 4th chapter is kind of the findings chapter, and 5th chapter is always pedagogical implications, as Francine does them. So I think there are some variations, but the way that they're done at Maryland, it's that kind of format, and it's based in the work of Van Manen, who was Francine's mentor.
Well, I have another question if nobody else objects. This is my second phenomenological dissertation that I've read, after having read Maggie's, well, not the whole thing, but parts of them, after having read Maggie's. And what struck me was how similar they are to a really good ethnography, which is the methodology that I am interested in. Your work, Sarah, had this incredible narrative flow to it, and yet was also still really grounded in scholarship and literature. So I was wondering, as kind of an aspiring ethnographer who would love to write something so as beautiful as your work, how you approach your prose style, and like how conscious you were of that. And also, we as doctoral students, I think, get so trained to write in this like dry academic style that I find pretty like off-putting. So I definitely want to avoid that in my own writing. Can you talk about how you came to that?
Well, I think with phenomenology, something that really helps is having a governing metaphor. Right, and my metaphor, I mean, flow is part of the metaphor, but my governing metaphor, which shows up in my chapter 2, is the circuit. So I really try to use that as a unifying source. So everything, I try to consciously connect back to the idea of circuit as metaphor, or electricity as metaphor, or spiral as a kind of metaphor as well. So I think that's one thing that helps me have some unity. And I think that's typical of phenomenological writing, as Francine has students do it. So I think that helps. But I also think that as those of us with English and literature backgrounds, this is just, for the most part, how many of us write. It's just how we write. And phenomenology allows for that in a way that I think other kinds of research disciplines don't. And maybe Maggie would have more kind of thinking about that. Because I think she has the same or similar kind of draw toward phenomenology.
Yeah, Maggie, I see you making a distinction between the two.
Mm-hmm. So 2 distinctions that I made, because first of all, coming from like the creative writing background, I thought, well, and also phenomenology makes a parallel with poetry. So I thought, well, this is just like poetry. Poets seek to resuscitate language. Poets seek to ask these bigger questions. Poets seek to describe being in the world. And that was something I had a hard time with in the beginning. I'll get to ethnography in a second. But I thought, Gadamer talks about the idea that in an aesthetic kind of writing, the language can cover over the phenomenon, and that in phenomenology we seek to uncover the phenomenon. So that was one way, and in that way, meaning poetry can be interpreted in multiple ways by a reader, and phenomenology is supposed to always be pointing toward that phenomenon. So that's it. Ethnography is something I feel so close to, because I feel like, especially in autoethnography, it is attempting to describe I don't know that it describes being in the world. I think it attempts more to describe culture and context, and I think that's one step back from what phenomenology tries to do. So I think phenomenology just tries to take that from culture and context into really what does it mean to be in the world. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I always think of, I can't remember, there's a guy whose name is also Van Manen, who writes about ethnography, and he says, again, what I wrote in there, which is that in ethnography, we seek to describe the other world, meaning we step out in a way of the context and try to describe that world. Even as an autoethnographer, we still try to step out and describe context. But in phenomenology, I would say we try to step in and be in and describe that being in. So, yeah. But I don't know that my writing, I mean, I feel like this is a very large departure from the kind of writing that I do in my own writing, anyway. So I don't know if that answers the question. You were saying it's because we're English majors. I mean, I found the transfer okay, but my own writing is not like this. I tell stories and write poems, but it seems like a different part of the brain or something. I don't know.
I think Maggie, that you described it really well, and I think too that we make the distinction that phenomenology isn't just qualitative, it's interpretive. So if we're thinking about a spectrum, right, of pure quantitative all the way to qualitative, that interpretive research is kind of like past that point, right? That it really is about being in the world, but also recognizing that we can't separate ourselves as researchers from the world in which we are also embodied participants. Yeah.
And I also think a huge distinction, I'm sorry for talking so much, but a huge distinction is Van Manen's focus on action. And a lot of different research traditions have the idea that it's supposed to, that action is at the heart. Critical race theory and critical feminist theory are focused in that direction. But I feel like that's specific to phenomenology, that we're supposed to align ourselves with being in the world and make not just the action in the world, but almost an action in ourselves as researchers. Maybe you don't think that's true, Sarah, but that's my sort of sense of it.
I do think that's true. I think that, and this comes up in my final chapter, which you don't have, but the pedagogical implication, part of it is that learning is transformation. And research, we can't not be transformed by the research that we do, and we can't separate ourselves, that we are participating in that research even as we're doing it. We can't separate out all those pieces of ourselves, myself as teacher, myself as runner, myself as writer, also as a researcher. It's another layer, but it's all part of a whole, and that it becomes something transcendent almost.
Is the ethnographer expected to do that, to separate herself out, do you think? Or maybe Maggie, you know?
In my understanding, to some extent, Maggie asked how I'm describing flow thinking, and how am I describing pedagogical implications for the teachers as opposed to pedagogical implications for the world at large. So I guess I'll start with the flow thinking. I guess I used lots of examples from literature in chapter 2 to kind of develop that idea of words kind of pouring forth or pouring in. So there's this great Emily Dickinson quote about how when she wrote poetry, she felt like the top of her head was taken off. And just this idea of words pouring out or words pouring in. And actually, there's some of it in the 4th chapter where one of the teachers read to me an email from a student who had this kind of flow experience in her classroom, where just was able to write and write and write. And it's that kind of thinking as well, where everything seems connected, that all of these ideas are present, and you can see very clearly the way that they fit together, and then the ideas just keep coming. And I think many of the writers that I talk to and have kind of experienced that. So that was kind of how I went about characterizing it. I don't know if that answers your question. And then the second part, so I really focused in Chapter 5 on pedagogical implications for the classroom, because I was working with teachers. So I think the world at large is kind of implicit, but I really wanted to work with what was happening in these teachers' classrooms and what made them, I think, to me, seem like they were connected to students and connected to each other and able to engage in a way that was enhanced by them seeing themselves and their students as whole people. And some of that comes from movement, and some of it comes from reflection, which is a part of that meditative piece. But, you know, it came into this kind of weird multi-layered place where the movement opened up our conversations. So they were able to walk first and kind of pour themselves into their journals, and then we would sit down and they would kind of pour themselves out in the conversations, and they each took on a pretty different focus. So their journals, they all wrote poetry in their journals. They weren't instructed to do that. I asked them some questions, gave them some suggestions about things that they could write, but they all wrote these kind of beautiful observational pieces about the world around them that they walked through. So I thought that was really interesting. So in their journals, they were writers, and in our conversations, they were teachers. And I really liked the implication of that wholeness. So maybe that's the pedagogical implication in the world, right? That we can't separate out who we are. Does that answer your question, Maggie? Good. Okay, so I see a question from Brecca, deciding to meet 4 times. And that was partly on Francine's suggestion. So it was kind of this, what do the teachers have time for? What do I have time for? How much transcribing can I do? What kind of conversations will evolve out of 4 hours or 4 sessions? So we met between 2 hours and 3 hours each time we met. And they were given time to walk and write, and then we talked. And we actually did meet 5 times, but the 5th session was very informal, and I didn't record any of it. And we talked mostly that last session about their continued journaling, and then they sent me their journals after that. So, I don't know, 4 just felt right. We had agreed that we would add more if we needed to, but I had so much just rich conversation and thinking from those 4 sessions that I didn't need anymore. So they all wrote already. They have English backgrounds, but I come from a National Writing Project background, and I believe that all teachers should be writers, and that all teachers of writing should write. So that was the basis for my assertion that they were writers. And I think that they see themselves as writers. Even my one participant, Tracy, who really struggled with both teaching and writing, she saw herself as an out-of-practice writer. So I think that was interesting too. But though I think, they all said that at different points in their lives, they had written more or written less.
Can you describe the thematizing process? You guys, phenomenologists don't code, is that correct?
Well, Thor codes.
Oh, okay. Maybe you guys can tell me about your different experiences.
But, so in my 5th chapter, my body metaphor, I try to start each chapter with some kind of movement, like a description of some kind of movement. And in my 5th chapter, it's about climbing. And I describe this experience where I'm climbing and I'm stuck, and my climbing partner, I tell him, I want to come down. I'm done. I can't do this. I want to come down. And he starts to let me down, and I kind of swing out from the rock, and suddenly I see exactly where my hands and feet should go. And I was like, no, I want to go back. Put me back on the rock. And that's what thematizing is like for me. Like, as I'm transcribing, I can just see. It's like almost like the ideas light up. It sounds really weird and really not researchy, but that's how it works for me. It's really kind of, it's an interesting and wonderful experience that, I can see as I'm typing, as I'm listening, I can see things light up.
That's a really cool metaphor. How about you, Thor?
I do code. I would compare it to line-by-line coding. I use the participants' words like verbs that they use or adjectives that kind of bounce off of the existentials of live time, live body, live place, live relationship. So how are they describing those types of being in the world? And that's how I build my codes off of that, or build my themes through that. So it's through the words. But I would consider it coding, similar to what I've done with Christian greenhouse work that I've been doing for the last 2 years. Although this is more grounded in philosophy rather than theoretical things.
So they're derived from verbs specifically?
I wouldn't say verbs, but I would go from sentence. How are they understanding what they're talking about in a sentence? Who's the theme? Who's the subject of the sentence? What kind of action are they kind of talking about? Is it a bodily sense? Is it a relationship sense? Is it a time sense? That type of thing. You'll see more when you read some of my stuff, I guess. So that's how I build my themes.
Cool, thanks. Thor, Sarah's asking if you use coding software.
Yes. I use in vivo. I don't do any cross-correlating codes to see if there are codes that correlate with each other that you would probably do in other methodologies, but I use it just to organize my themes. It really helps me break down and see what's falling into each theme when I go back to my writing.
So we did talk about seasons, but I don't think that I made that connection until you asked this question. That it is almost like a rhythm, a flow of seasons. So maybe I need to look back at this chapter and write about that a little more. But something that I write about in chapter 5 in that pedagogical implications is the things that these teachers are doing to bring nature even more into their classrooms. So one of them just received a grant to build an outdoor classroom. So something like that, taking students out or bringing the classroom inside. So having plants in their classrooms, reading literature that's related to nature, things like that. And I think too that there are some good sources on that. Like there's a book about nature deficit disorder called Last Child in the Woods that I draw from a little bit, and thinking about how there's some research and statistics that even having a tree outside one's window in an office building makes more productive work. So things like that. I don't think it has to be total immersion in order to have an effect, and I think some of the other research shows that as well. But again, my work really focused on these teachers and their experience, because perhaps something that phenomenology really asks us to think about is the particular instead of the generalizable. So I don't know that it would work in another setting the same way that it works here, and I don't think you can force that. So Maggie's asking about anti-flow, and we actually talk about being stuck and stuckness, and that comes out in the chapter 5, which I guess is anti-flow. what it means to be stuck and then how to get unstuck. And that's one of the biggest pedagogical implications in chapter 5.
When I asked that question, I was thinking, so there is flow. There might be something in between flow and stuck. And I guess I was wondering if you kind of in between space of those two things. Because to me, stuck is not writing, and anti-flow is writing flow. Because, I mean, we've all had the experience of being like, this is just flowing out of me. And then we also have had the experience of like, I just have to keep typing. I must keep typing. So I guess I was wondering if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, that makes more sense to me when you're phrasing it that way. So one of the things that I'm writing about in chapter 5 is the idea that environment can set up a sense of care that allows students to be stopped but not stuck, right? So like a stage in which they can ruminate, right? That being able to think and not pushing the process, but that there are ways to continue moving without having flow. So yes, yeah, I've been thinking about that. And even, I think, Lucy Calkins and Donald Murray both talk about fostering a classroom environment that allows students to be comfortable enough to be in a place where they can work at a pace that's comfortable and productive for them. So yeah, there's a whole section on that in chapter 5.
That's so interesting. I'm sorry, Dora. I think it's so interesting too because I think students imagine that all writing happens in that flow state sometimes, that they think if they're not getting to that, then, or I guess I think that they think that real writers just have flow. They sit down and the words come out of them when we as writers know that that's not the case. I think, so that's interesting just to think about it again. Please gotta burp the baby. I don't know if there's a question on that, but that idea, like you said, Lucy Calkins, of fostering that there is the work of writing, that it's, it can, it may be that it's not always in that, so that it's in that in-between state. So I think that's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Donald Graves says that writing is sweaty business.
Yeah.
Sarah.
Yeah.
Sorry. How much have you read on Heidegger's notion of familiarity of world, the term familiarity and how meaning and understanding come out of being familiar with the world?
Thank you.
And I think that really goes with how flow is developed. You can't have flow if you don't have the familiarity.
Is that in Being in Time?
It is. I think it's starting around page 116 to 150-ish. There's all the, I could pull out my Being in Time here. I can go grab it real quick.